Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. I'm your host, Hena Zaberi, and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. While India is often seen as a champion of secular democracy, fascism and xenophobia are rampant against its Muslim minority. Hate crimes have drastically increased, and the Dodo database has reported 1,400 hate crimes in India since 2014. Those who have fallen victim to BJP's hostility, BJP, which is the ruling party in India currently, are no longer afforded their rights and are often left helpless. Joining us today is Sharib Ali. Sharib Ali is the co-founder of Quill Foundation. He works on the Innocence Network in India and is also actively engaged with Citizens Against Hate. He's an associate scholar with the chair of political anthropology at the University of Bern in Switzerland and spends his time between New Delhi and Geneva. So, Assalamu alaikum, Sharib. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's a pleasure to have you here and to really learn from you about what is currently taking place in India and to give your perspective, especially from a human rights perspective and from the work that you have been doing on the justice system in India. So tell us a little bit more about the Quill Foundation and some of the work that you do.
Thank you, Hena, for inviting me. This is a great opportunity for certain voices to get heard. Quill started in 2015, and it was the result of many of us doing work on civil political rights issues in India for some time. If you will see, it's around 2008 when the Batla House encounter took place, that finally a lot of people, especially the civil society, realized that this whole terrorism discourse is actually not based on facts. Of course, many people knew it before that too, but there wasn't this consensus built. But post-2008, there seemed to be, the state seemed to have taken another turn. It was getting much more violent. And it was criminalizing minorities and of all kinds, linguistic, religious, ethnic. It was becoming a different kind of police state. And many of us had experiences of, either through others or personally, of being criminalized by the state, because that is the history of terrorism prosecutions in India, where a young generation, politically active, even though they may not know the precise democratic terms or the frameworks within which to articulate themselves, but the anger and the rights basis were the same. So we all had that experience of whatever it is that we were saying was being criminalized in various forms, whether in courts of law or in our neighborhoods. I think in India, this legal and social discourse always goes together. So we sort of imbibed that in ways that we didn't know ourselves. And I was a researcher at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. I finished my master's and I wanted to do something, really get active. And I decided I would just go around the country and look at the terrorism discourse, whether it's standing on evidence or not. And after I got in that process, when I hadn't received a fellowship till then, but in that process, when I was arrested by some of the Sangh Parivar members, through them, not arrested by them, I got that fellowship. So I had like about 2.5 years of research, looking at terror cases across the country, meeting victims. And then met my other colleague, Mr. Sohail Keke from Kerala, and we realized that this is a very important intervention to say that, or to prove, because there hasn't been any such thing till now, to say that this terrorism discourse, this whole action of the state, which is targeting minorities particularly, is a political move, trying to say that what these people are saying, what Muslims are saying in India, is actually terrorism.
Mm.
So, and this is not based on fact. There is no evidence, even now, factually, that Indian Muslims were actually trying to destabilize the state. There is no evidence yet. Student Islamic movement prosecutions across post 2001, since it was banned, you will not find a single tribunal, a single evidence yet. It's all under trials. And all the judgments which have come out, we were looking at many of the overall statistics. For example, in the state of Maharashtra, there were about 42 cases which got over, out of which there were 40 were acquittals.
40 were acquittals. Wow.
40 were acquittals. Now, what does that say? That the state does not have the evidence. And if you don't have the evidence, it's not a problem of evidence gathering, because these were prosecutions under terror laws. And terror laws anyway lower the threshold of evidence. So even within these lower thresholds, the state was unable to really go ahead and say anything about what is it that they actually did, because they didn't do it.
And what was the effect on these 40 cases of people who had been falsely accused of terrorism? What was the effect on their lives? Who were these people who had been? Could you tell us a little bit behind the statistics of who? Tell us some stories.
The Student Islamic movement was at one point the student wing of the Jamaat-e-Islami Hind in India. Okay. Now, what does the student wing mean? Jamaat-e-Islami Hind is a sort of a cultural organization, very different from other organizations in that it was not cleric. It was not like the Jamiyat, which is a body of clerics. It was a body of citizens who focused on education, on Maulana Maududi's teachings, and they had a particular idea of political life. But these were largely people, middle class, service sector people who were working in the Gulf or in certain other places. Simi was the younger generation, now growing up between the 80s and the 90s, and this is the time when Hindu radicalization is extreme in India. You have the Advani's Rath Yatra, and if you look at the BJP's fortunes, from 2 seats in 81, it goes to forming a government into 1999. And it follows the Rath Yatra. But the Rath Yatra is just a representative. It's just a symbolic representation of the rise of the Hindutva movement. Because there were many other things that were happening at the same time. There was deeply layered work that was happening in neighborhoods. There was the Babri movement. There was all these kind. There were riots across the country, wherever the Rath Yatra. So radicalization that was overall pushed by the Hindutva movement also had its effects on the Muslim community, of course. Because in neighborhoods, this is if anybody is going to go ahead and murder you, or anybody going to go ahead and say that you were a criminal, then of course you will turn around and say, I mean, that's bullshit. I mean, the equations of the relationship are set at that very moment. So these were semi-urban, urban youth, middle class, largely upper caste, I would say. The Student Islamic movement was largely upper caste. But anyhow, the Pasmanda Muslims are not in a lot of spaces to be heard. So within that large group, these were a group of Muslims who believed that they were Muslims, who also believed that they were in the country and living within the constitution, but they were not happy with the shift, with the Hindutva overtaking the state. And so, of course, they were vocal, they were angry. And Hindutva taking the state takes small actions. In the neighborhood, there is a placement of an idol. There is a concerted, systematic attempt to take you away from education. There's an attempt at your businesses. That's how it works in the socioeconomic field. So, of course, they were very active and vocal. And that is what Simi happened. But Simi broke away from Jamaat-e-Islami in 10 years because it started articulating its anger, which Jamaat-e-Islami was not happy with, because it has had it knew its place. But of course, young people don't know their places. And like Mr. Floyd, the people are shown their places by putting a knee on the neck. And a lot of young people are not willing to accept it. And Simi wasn't willing to accept it, and of course got criminalized, so it got banned. And as soon as it got banned, the procedure is that you have the cases across the country were filed. So there were about 1,000 people that were immediately arrested across the country. People barged into homes, like the police barged into homes, took them away. And these were largely charges. I mean, the whole legal discourse is fraught with these charges of poster publishing, of sloganeering, of participating in meetings. I studied the overall discourse, both Simi and post-Simi, which is what I do as an anthropologist, mostly a legal one. And this whole, you see across the charge sheets of those 10 years of prosecutions of Simi, we're pushing just one narrative, that these people were angry about the demolition of Babri Masjid and the Gujarat riots. And look at the cause, look at the intent, which is the principal thing in a legal charge sheet. And they're saying that, okay, they were circulating videos of Gujarat riots. They were circulating videos of Babri Masjid. Now, this is a bit of a strange thing, because it seems that the state thinks that Muslims in India have enough cause, the reason to be angry. And then they held the anger against the community itself, that you may have a cause, and which is precisely why we are going to criminalize you. There was no attempt to even understand the roots of that cause. And that's what a security state does. It just looks at it as a technical issue and not a socio-political issue. So,
can I ask you a question on that? So from a foreign American context, does the Indian Constitution, what are the rights of gatherings? What are the rights of, what is the right to speak, the right to freedom of speech? What could you put that in context for us?
Yeah, we have, of course, all these rights between the articles of the constitutional articles from 14 to 22, and they also draw themselves from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's the general nature, freedom of assembly and association and articulation. Now, within India, the jurisprudence says that you can have reasonable restrictions. And the reasonable restrictions are not really spelled out. But of course, everybody is free to convene and to have organizations. And but with the coming in, and this is a good entry point, with the coming in of terror laws. Now, terror laws work specifically against Muslims or against Northeasterns or against Kashmiris or against the people who had control over the forest. These are Adivasis and tribals and also all other kinds. Now, terror laws were reasonable restrictions, but they were not reasonable at all. And whenever it was challenged in front of the Indian judiciary, it never upheld it. There was an overall, it never upheld the fact that these violated fundamental rights. So Indian Muslims, like any other Indian citizens, had the right to come together and to discuss anything that they wanted, including the demolition of Babri Masjid or the Gujarat riots. But of course, the state didn't like that. The turns that the state was taking didn't like that. In India today, you cannot discuss these things. And if you do, you will be criminalized, which is the message that, within now sort of we are the younger generation of activists now, and we think of that some of these people were a bit stupid, the way they were talking, we would never do it. And I was thinking the other day, that's not true. Because if I would be there at that time, I would probably do it the same way, because they didn't have this retrospective view that this democratic state is going to not allow them doing that.
That's fascinating for me to hear, because this preemptive criminalization of speech has taken place against Muslims over here as well. We have this case of Dr. Tariq Mahanna, several other cases like that, where people have been like and remember, this was also the time of like chat groups and forums and a very different kind of activism than is currently in vogue. So this is something else that, we're going to get to this further on in the discussion. I really want to discuss how activism has changed under the Hindutva rule. So tell us more about these cases that were accused. Were these 350 individuals, were they activists, were they academics, political figures, or were they all students?
You mean in the Simi prosecutions?
In Maharashtra, your Maharashtra.
Yes, yes. Well, overall, these were local people who were maybe students, because the membership was limited to under 30 years. So there's some of them were students, some of them had normal jobs, some of them were not fancy, very urbanized actors per
Mm,
se. They did not have that linguistic command, which is what I'm saying. That even though they were upper caste, they were coming from semi-urban or even in the urban, in ghettoized spaces. They were not, for example, children of people who were living in elite neighborhoods.
okay.
So yes, they were the people, and they were criminalized under various charges. And this is the terror law, Porter, that was brought in, and Porter allowed confessions to police officers as admissible in courts. Of course, you've opened the door for torture, something
Mm,
that India hasn't ratified since 1997, even after signing the convention.
okay.
So of course, torture is principally used. There were many others who were also extrajudicially killed, like it happens in any. If you look at the conflict in the Northeast or in Kashmir, or how student activists or even certain kinds of criminals or petty thieves were treated, uh, yes, they were either criminalized or killed off. So, for example, if you see who were the people who were accused of terrorism charges, these were semi-urban upper caste people who were raising their voices. But look at the social demography of the people who were lynched. Look at the kind of people whose houses were invaded and their fridges were investigated. These were a different kind of poor, rural poor, maybe even lower caste at certain places. Um,
And
yeah, sorry, I digressed.
can you explain that to us? Because a lot of times we look at caste purely from a Hindu lens, right? What does, and I've heard that a few times, you mentioning that, and perhaps some of our audience may not be familiar with that. Um, so how are Muslim classified into different castes?
From the little that I know,
Hmm.
the principal social order in India is caste,
Hmm.
even though we may deny it. And more than looking at caste as a very religious, Hindu religious thing, I think it would help if we look at it as a technology of power, as the principal thing that marks an aberration between people. So caste is like in Hindu society, you're supposed to, it has a theological element and it organizes society around that. So Brahmins have come out from the head, and hence, of course, they do the headish sort of work, and they get those privileges. And Vaishyas and the traders, and then the Shudras, which are the principal majority of the population, and the Ati Shudras, who are just supposed to serve the upper caste.
Mm.
So this is a way of organizing people, rooting what they are going to do, their livelihoods, their work in their birth.
Okay.
Principally, what racism does.
Exactly.
So I would say that caste and racism both are certain technologies of power, which just organize society, saying you are lower, I'm higher. Now, even though technically we may not have in as Muslims, we may not have it in this caste system is not theologically rooted anywhere. Some tribalism could be, as far as I know.
Mhm.
Or at least in its practice could be looked at it like that. But in the Indian subcontinent, because caste has been continuing for 10,000 of years, whether the
Mhm.
British came or the Mughals came or any other political system came, the social order remained intact and was based on caste.
Mm.
So even when that was such a fundamental subconscious force of society, that anybody entering as a religious force, as a political force, as a legal force, or whatever kind, even the modern state when it entered as a legal system, it had to contend with caste. So Muslims are equally, I would say, though they may not practice untouchability, they may not practice it in the same harsh ways as some certain other people do. But I think Muslims are fairly divided into castes. The Ajlafs and the Ashrafs have, if you look at where the Ashrafs live and where the Ajlafs live, if you look at who are the top, there's a recent a friend of mine wrote about a lot of these autobiographies of Muslims are coming. which are not autobiographies, but they try to tell the story of our times. And 100% of them are upper caste families, whether they are the Hashmis or the Naqvis or somebody else. Really upper caste, who were feudal in origins in their own rural locations. There's not a single Pasmanda person who has written their own story as the story of the times. And all these people, while they are talking about secularism and the rise of communalism, which is fairly easy, almost completely are close to the idea that a lot of what they did and they say is coming from their caste origins.
Wow. So what would be some of the names of maybe family names so people would recognize that here, that would not be from the Hashmis and the Naqvis, but from that need to be heard as well?
Kidwise, for example.
Okay.
Kidwise and...
Interesting.
Yeah. But I'm not getting it right now, but...
Yeah, share with us maybe later a link or something that we could, people who are interested could look that up. So this is fascinating, but to perhaps bring us back to, we've seen this rise of Hindutva fascism in India now. How has this impacted human rights activism? And under this, like, how has this affected the work? Share with us, especially under CAA. What did you see? What were the trends that you've seen?
So at Quill, we were initially started with looking at counterterrorism.
Okay.
And similarly, we had Mr. Sajjad, an IAS officer, who was looking at access to social access to sort of economic or educational rights in rural areas. But this for the Modi 2.0 that comes in, you have the first BJP government in 1999, which stays till 2004, and then we had the next one in 2009. That sort of changed a lot of things. And while we were doing research and working with the sort of opposing at the policy level, but this Hindutva takeover of the state with such a brute majority almost put a gun to our heads or a knee to our necks, and immediately these lynchings started happening. And these extrajudicial killings in UP, for example, and especially all of this was concentrated in the Hindi belt, the Central Indian belt, which is the most productive regions of the world in terms of its sheer agricultural capacity. And of course, it is in the most productive regions of the world that we find such violence. So I remember one day when Mr. Hassan called and he said, there are these lynchings that have happened. We were all very worried, and they were happening in Haryana, which is so close to Delhi. Mewat, which is the poorest region, one of the districts of India, which the Human Development Index there is lower than Sub-Saharan Africa, and it is all Muslim. And that's where some of the lynchings took place, and in UP and in Jharkhand. So we just borrowed a car from a friend, and we went for fact findings, and that's how it all started. That's how Citizens Against Hate got birthed. And of course, why did we have to? You see, there's just a shift in the name. Something like a Quill Foundation and something like an Innocence Network or a Citizens Against Hate is in itself reflective of what changes these were. As Muslims, we were not confident enough to do this from, let's say, an NGO point of view, or even to do this from a point of view to say that, okay, I am doing this. No, this had to be a network where we had to put faces in front just to shield ourselves. So Citizens Against Hate is like a network of a lot of people. Nobody knows who they are. So that's one of the costs of it. And so we started investigating lynchings. We started investigating encounter killings. We started investigating all kinds of violations. And we were part of that generation, at least a few Muslims, and there were a lot of other, especially Sikhs and Punjabis, and a lot of India has these universities and schools that had been a long tradition of producing people. And of course, Quill and Citizens Against Hate and Innocence Network started attracting some of these really young energies. And we just went and somehow, God willing, with the grace of God, we had people coming in with money, people coming in with some other resources, and we just started from scratch, absolutely from scratch, from the ghettos. It's a different thing to move from scratch from the ghettos to the capital, to the Lutyens, Delhi, and try to speak to them. So yeah, so I
This
think
is
activism.
fascinating. I think around that time, I can say this, that a group of Indian activists had contacted me on, I edit a platform called Muslim Matters. And so they were like, we do not have, like, we have a Council of American Islamic Relations here. And they're like, we don't have anything like that. We don't have anything, even like a platform like Muslim Matters, where Indian Muslims can speak about our issues. And how did you guys form it? How did it happen? Like, how did it, why did you guys start? So that was a very interesting conversation that was taking place maybe 5-6 years ago. And you laid the groundwork for this even before that, because it wasn't just like overnight you guys started. What you have described as a groundwork had been laid out because of all that what was going on over there. This is why I believe Muslim minorities in different countries need to be talking to each other much more. We cannot continue our work in silos, because the oppressors are talking to each other. They're exchanging strategies. They're meeting. Even things like hearing what they say about use the tactics that the Obama used against Muslims in Burma. And we've heard Hindu preachers say this. We've heard Hindu politicians say this. So this is so now. So once the work, the database. Let's talk about this database. What are some of the findings that you all have found? What are I look at this. It's something that is it's helping people fight India's claim of championing secularism and democracy. And could you tell us more about this database?
The idea of Doto, this name is going to change, but it's a funny name because its full form is documentation of the oppressed.
Okay.
It also says a lot about our politics. We were one of the first people to look at ourselves as citizens and Muslims, and not principally as Muslims. That Muslims could speak in a human rights language, which of course US migrants sort of realized fairly quickly. But Indian Muslims don't seem to have realized that. They're still caught in that bind of democracy and Islam and all of that. Even though they don't do anything about it, it's just a bind. It's more of a thought bind. But at least I was very clear that this is a constitutional body, that this speaks the language of rights. And in that, we were looking at, of course, the hate crimes, and we had various difficulties. But the larger trends, if you see, and we took the data as 2014. We had some other documentation before that, but we realized there's very poor documentation about hate crimes against Muslims. Because how do you even do that? India is such a vast country, and Muslims in small villages. Some of it reaches the regional press. And of course, we're sitting in Delhi. How many regional languages will we read?
Oh, wow. Exactly.
And we do not have that kind of capacity. We do not have that kind of resource, even the mental resource to think through it in these terms, to decide to sort of. But I think through Doto, as a team, there was Fawaz Shaheen, and there's Vipul Kumar, and there's Baljit Kaur, and we all sort of grew in the process of getting clarity. So if you look at what is Doto saying, over the last 5 years, we have had systematic attempt to push the Muslim community into a corner. People have been, lynching is very symbolic. It's a very symbolic act. It represents something much deeper. in the same way how lynching emerged in the US as Mr. Lynch, who came to discipline the slaves, and he devised this as a a political method to send a message. It was the first act of lynching was a symbol of the deep reality of racism in the US. And in a similar way, lynching started as soon as there was state capture by the Hindutva. So we have lynchings, we have extrajudicial killings by the police of Muslims, also Dalits. We have a concerted attack on religious infrastructure. We've had mosques everywhere, and these mosques were attacked in various different ways, whether their idols are placed, and of course, Babi Masjid is the iconic case. But in every neighborhood, there are smaller encroachments within the Muslim socio-religious space. And all these encroachments were based on hate. And religious infrastructure in India also contains the educational infrastructure to some extent, because it is linked to it. The establishment of madrasas, because in India, under Section 32 of the Constitution, minorities have the right to establish and run their own institutions. And that also came under concerted attack. And you see that when we went and looked into lynchings, we found that wherever there was one lynching, there were at least 10 encounter killings around that area.
Oh, wow.
So it was more like, if you look at it, how things operate. And wherever there's lynching and encounter killing, there's a concerted attack on the educational institutions around them, because these lynchings could take place in a space where there were certain dominant relations or certain Hindutva hold on the social space where they could be mobilized. People could be mobilized.
And the state was either looking away or actively participating.
Yeah. So it depended on where you are talking about. And so a lot of these, legal shifts were coming in. For example, cow became such a central issue. And of course, everybody knows it's just a political thing. Hindutva doesn't give two hoots about animal welfare, because it doesn't give two hoots about human welfare. Why would it give two hoots about animal welfare? But, you have these cow vigilantes coming up, and the Sangh Parivar, which was, whether it's the Bajrang Dal or the Hindu Yuva Vahinis, these were all social militant groups. Now, they were working in tandem. And what couldn't be done via the state was being done via them. So it was these people who were lynching, who were attacking religious infrastructure, educational infrastructure, who were also depriving. Now, it's one thing to take away Muslim land, take away Muslim educational institutions. It's another thing to, let's say, like a Dalit, to stop them from reaping water from a well. This is just a metaphor for many kinds of access that were denied. The ghettoization was also parallelly happening. So it was all systematic, and you see that in several states at the same time bring in legal courts, laws, which sort of formalize these vigilante gangs as police mitras, police friends. This was the first step of formalizing vigilante mobs as state forces. Of course, wherever these people did become police mitras, then everything becomes official.
So can you put this in, share with us, like, how does that fall in? Is this similar? Is this the same thing as RSS? Is this separate from RSS? Are they influenced by?
So RSS is a completely social body. RSS is not registered anywhere. Okay. Which there's a lot of talk about banning the RSS. I know in the US, especially within the Muslim groups. How do you ban an organization that doesn't even exist? The RSS is a parivar, it's a family. It's a mix of many different groups. It's a set of NGOs, it's a set of cultural codes, it's a set of actions, it's a set of massive network of neighborhood shakas, which function in the neighborhood from a neighborhood point of view. So, of course, these were just people. These were not part of any state forces. A big agenda of these people was to capture state forces, whether it was institutions, whether it was political parties, whether it was the IAS services, whether it was the steel machinery that was administrating India, whether it was political parties. So, which is, I think, that something the Muslim community just did not do. All who could get educated in India sort of left the country.
Mm.
Of course, the situation, I mean, this is not to pin blame.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody was looking for better opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
There is no wrong in looking for better opportunity, but it's just how history unfolded. The whoever had the privilege to go to Pakistan first left to Pakistan,
Mm-hmm.
and then after that, the first generation, whoever really the cream, went to the US or UK.
Mm-hmm.
So and then whoever could not get anything anywhere went to the Gulf as laborers.
Mm.
And whatever little then entrepreneurship sort of supported. So overall, there was a massive state of poverty of all kinds. And that was the perfect ground to Hindutva to take over institutions, processes, parties, political, legal, everything. And they did.
Hmm. This is so what happens now? I mean, what is happening currently? There are young people, there are other activists in a legal Muslim university, Jamia, that have stood up. And what is happening to them? What is transpiring with them? And if you could, when you talk about that, if you could tell us what's happening from within the justice system.
Yeah. So you see that when the Modi government comes to power in 2014, they did not have as big a majority in parliament as compared to 2019, which is a brute majority. So 2014 was much of the groundwork that was coming later. And I'm building this as a context to what exactly the way people who are raising voices are being treated right now. It's a result of something that's happened over the last 10 years. I think the capacity that the Hindutva has in India to engineer reality is an unprecedented capacity. In many ways, we are similar to the US, but I think there's some fundamental distinctions. In the US, the army, the military, and the media is never in the same level of control by the right as we have in India. We have an almost total control of Hindutva on the media, on big industry, and now judiciary, higher levels of the judiciary. You cannot have a fascist overturn of the political system without the media and the military. And I mean, you can have a brute majority in parliament, but the democratic system, the modern system, has its own checks and balances.
Yeah,
but those checks and balances are just not possible in India because the principal judicial body has been subverted to a great extent. You look at the Assam NRC situation, the executive wanted it to happen, but it's actually the Supreme Court who went and did it. Mr. Ranjan Gogoi, who's an Ahom from a tribal, a superior feeling tribal from Assam. And Assam has always been the outpost of Indian Brahmins.
So can you lay that out for us? What caused this fall of the legal system in India? And I've seen, like, this is something very important to address because when the hearings took place, the Kashmir hearings took place, both the secretary at that time, the assistant secretary from the State Department, and the new assistant secretary that had come in, both glorified their trust in the Indian legal system. They glorified the fact that this is why India is a great democracy, and they believe in the Indian legal system, and they believe that democracy will work in India because of their faith in the legal system.
And that, to a great extent, was true, but it's not so anymore. And it's a problem that we face at the international level very much, especially at the UN Human Rights Council or at Brussels. Yes, compared to the newly independent countries, India's had one of the strongest judicial bodies ever, because of a great tradition of lawyers in the Indian freedom movement and the belief, and also because Nehru stayed in power for 20 years and could lay the foundation of some of these principal foundation of some of these institutions. And we had enormously, of course, they were all a different kind of people, but they were really good jurists. We've had a whole tradition of jurists that not many other countries have.
Mhm.
But the way the Hindutva as a political ideology has, it is so sharp that it finds ways to encroach in all spaces through different means. It encroached in the political, the electoral sphere through just sheer violence and hate.
Mhm.
And that has been its principal mechanism. The judiciary, it has been a bit more, it's more about give and take. At least, I mean, right now I could be held for contempt for saying this, but it is true. The Supreme Court is in its lowest position, in its most stooping position ever in Indian history. And this is, I keep in mind the emergency when I say that.
Mhm.
Because it was for the first time in AJM Jabalpur, that judgment, that infamous judgment, which said that you do not have the right to judicial remedy during an emergency. Nowhere in the judicial discourse, in jurisprudence, can something like this be said within the modern democratic structure.
Mhm.
Now, this was at least in the official declaration of emergency. But right now, if you look at these students who have, students have raised their voices so much because all others have somehow been liquidated. You attack the movemental possibilities, the capabilities in the form of SIO, in the form of SIMI, and you've somehow told them that you will have to just stick your eyes to the ground, just look down. And somehow we have all, because we have all to survive, and there's no other way you can survive. So, of course, but university campuses, whether it's Jamia or AMU, which have traditionally been a kind of stronghold, and also university campuses across, because these are young people, they aren't going to listen to anybody so easily. So they have been, and I count myself as amongst them to some extent, led the protest. And the present government cannot take it. And you see that it has been using anti-terror laws. All these people, this Jamia Coordination Committee, which they've not really been coordinating the protests either, but they've, something is there. At least something they knew how to catch, because everybody else is a student. So you have, in the recent arrests over the last, since December, since CAA came in, and I think CAA, I'm digressing a little bit because the CAA became sort of like the watershed. There were legal changes that were slowly being brought in states. There was so much of lynching. There was so much, everybody was noticing changes in the overall socio-political setup. But it is in 2019 when Mr. Modi returns with a brute majority, with a complete control over media, also fake media, complete control, to a great extent control over the judiciary, that they actually try to subvert one of the fundamental bases of citizenship, which has been the longest Hindutva night dream, wet dream, whatever it is that you want to call it. So, and they attempted that. But even now, at least it can be said that even now, the opposition to something like that, I mean, the whole country went into a sort of a turmoil because of that. And students led it. Many other people led it. And all the conflicts that have been slowly going down, they were ruptured open again, whether it is the Punjab, whether it's Kashmir, whether it's Northeast. So you see that you see the Ayodhya judgment coming in, sort of giving a very clear signal of what the situation is, even from the judiciary. And this is a 5-0 judgment, a 5-member bench, and even somebody like a civil rights person, Chandrachud. Even Chandrachud is in on it. Chandrachud gave a dissenting judgment in many other things. In Aadhaar case, for example, he gives a very strong dissenting judgment, which is biometrics, which is the way India is taking into, how it will control its own citizens. So even though there are a few or one at least civil rights oriented jurisprudence, a judge there, in Ayodhya, that judge is also part of the judgment. So you see that there are certain consensus which was already made. And I sort of forgot the link of what I was saying. You see these.
You were talking about the student activists and even with the judiciary, the changes.
Yeah. So you see that the CAA sort of takes, when December 12th is when CAA is brought in. And you have massive protests coming up. You have AMU attacked, Aligarh Muslim University. You have Jamia attacked. There are bullets that are fired because that's how the Hindutva wants to see it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have these student protests across the country. There's protests in Assam, and all these people, whoever could be found at the top of it, all of them have been somehow arrested. Whether it's Farhan in AMU, whether it's ISA activists, whether it's Jamia Coordination Committee activists, women pregnant.
Pregnant.
And then you also have these, these Dalit activists being arrested.
Mm-hmm.
The Bhima Koregaon incident is very, very, very important and very critical. You have my dear friend Mahesh Raut, who was a prime minister's fellow, who's been in prison for 1 year. And of course, all these Jamia people, AMU people, somehow we were all part of the same circles. And then you have Gautam Naulakha, who has been the voice of the democratic rights, which has been supporting all kinds of dissent.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have Akhil Gogoi in Assam, who's been a person who has been on the ground mobilizing people for the right things. And you have this state who's saying, nobody can say any of this shit, and we're going to criminalize you under terror law. You use UAPA. What does the UAPA do? The UAPA allows preventive detention for 6 months. The UAPA takes away the powers of the judiciary to give you bail. The UAPA turns all evidence around in the way that you have to now defend yourself. So anyway, judicial powers are limited when the UAPA is brought into force. So that's one way. As soon as you use a terror law, judiciary's very attempt to put accountability there has been taken away. And that has been taken away politically, with the judiciary's consent. When TARA, the first terror law, was reviewed, the Indian Supreme Court said it's valid. 6 months later, the parliament says it's not valid because it's against human rights. So the Indian Supreme Court, even though it has been a fabulous court in a certain way, it has always bowed to the majority. I would say, when it comes to especially conflicts, when it comes to Kashmir, there's never been justice in the Indian Supreme Court. When it comes to the Northeast, when it comes to Manipur, 1,528 documented cases of extrajudicial killing. The special rapporteur, Christoph Heinz, comes in and says ASPA should be removed. These 1,528 cases are absolutely strong. There is a way that security forces, armed forces need to be brought to justice. And nothing happens. But now there's some 28 prosecutions opened. And now you see that these people were charged under UAPA. Of course, UAPA needs governmental sanction, but the judiciary could have still gone ahead and put checks. It didn't. It didn't do that. You have a pregnant woman inside prison being denied bail, and you look at the reasons offered by the judge. That is a person who has never read anything. There's nothing to do with judicial reasoning.
So where is Indian civil society? Where is, where are the secularists? Where are those voices? Like, it's hard to believe that in just these 7-8 years of BJP rule, they could all have been wiped out. Or where did they go? Are they speaking up? Are they, what is their stance? Or what is their stance?
Yeah, I know this is a depressing conversation. The situation is depressing at the moment. We've had a strong civil rights movement, but they have been decapacitated over the last some time. But even now, you have voices from the industry like Mahindra, established industrialists who would sort of support great amounts of neoliberal activity, which is very extractive for the forest, which may not be good for everybody. But at least these people are liberal-minded. And they don't want the rule of law to go away. So within the corporate industries, within the judiciary, within the services, whether it's the police or the administrative services, and within people, liberalism still, at least in the cities and within the upper caste, it still exists. But I think the fundamental thing that the Hindutva has been able to do, and this is what I'm analyzing slowly, is to turn this all around. And digital technology has also sort of really helped. And this whole fake news business, the capacity of this, see, anyway, we were in a precarious situation. It's unbelievable how these guys have exploited it. The Indian intelligentsia was very small in the first place. Look at the time of independence. I mean, we have a population of 1 billion, and how many were living in cities? But this was a massive superstructure that was put in a very castiest place, and it was being governed by a small, very small portion of that population. What the Hindutva has done is to open a can of worms by completely twisting, saying, whatever you guys are saying, you are so small in number, it doesn't matter. They have now elements of their own corporate, very reliance kind of corporate, which don't give a shit. It's crony capitalists. There's a difference between industrialists like the Taras and the Mahindras, who were always part of the nationalist movement, who were part of the modernist project. There's difference between somebody like that and somebody like Reliance or Adani's, which is just corporate greed. They have no limits. They have no belief in anything. So Hindutva has arrived with its own industrialists. They are not industrialists. These guys are just crony capitalists. And they've arrived with their own set of whatever they call masses, which are being, we cannot say that they are being misled, because that would be a very strange theory. But people who have never had any participation in democracy now are participating through hate.
And they're being taught that, right? Like we've talked earlier in this show about the WhatsApp, 30,000, 40,000 WhatsApp groups. So the how Facebook is involved, how all these technology companies based in the United States are contributing to the oppression of minorities overseas. One question that I have from our perspective, that the Indian government has continued to reject reports on human rights and religious freedom violations made by the State Department here and by the United States Commission on International Freedom, Religious Freedom. And this rejection is even further reflected in the Trump and Modi relationship, as both continue to edge closer and closer to a dictatorship. Both RSS and the BJP continue to gain power as violence continues. And here, as you can see, you're seeing this all around us over here, where protests, people have taken to the street against state violence. And obviously, the state violence we're protesting here it has a 400-year-old history, and it is nothing new. But because of several things coming together, COVID and the disparity and how Black Americans have been affected by this pandemic. So, looking at that, how best do you, like, we're in your position right now, how best do you think we can both work on protecting minority communities when our governments refuse to do so?
That's a tough question, and I don't have any wisdom, but some thoughts maybe.
Sure.
I was reading yesterday. I was reading Kannabiran, who was one of the foremost civil rights lawyers in the 1970s. I thought that what he was writing was very true even now. In India, a lot of the politics was working on the basis of, some of it at least was on the basis of ethics. People used to be considerate of an opposition, considerate of, what it would mean if they really step outside the bounds of democracy, or really just go ahead and be a hateful person. But those times seem to be going away. We see in the last 5 years, within the Indian industries, within the IAS officers, within the IPS officers, within the doctors guild, within the professional guild, within the trade guild, we always were used to silently continue what we continue to do and what we believe. But this is a bluff that was called by the right-wing government. The right-wing government, whether in the US and whether here, I don't know so much about the US, but they just kept pushing and pushing and pushing till the time nobody could take it. We Indians are used to adjust. And we think that, okay, if we adjust a little bit, somehow things will come right. But then we got pushed to such a corner that only then people realize, if they're not going to speak up, nothing's going to be, this going to die. So then you see, a group of IS officers speaking out, then you have certain army people speaking out. But this culture is still not there. And I think whether as an immigrant group, Muslims, or whether as a natural group, citizenship group, I think that some of our trainings in modern liberties, and when I say modern liberties, I'm referring to its structural components.
Mhm.
I think to understand us as a citizen, first and foremost, in the political sphere, to understand us as citizens and to just be adamant about it, whether, I mean, in all ways possible, that is the only sort of task that we have, because that will lead to a different kind of mentality, which will translate into more democratic, at the same time conscious working.
Mm.
A lot of our organizations, institutions, are all moribund because they are not very different from Hindutva organizations. Meaning, what I mean to say here is that it's all about maintaining certain status quo relations.
Mm.
So whether it's in community organization, whether it's a Jamaat Islami, whether it's the Jamiatul Ulama, whether you know that we have all these many bodies who ultimately control it, like the whether it's a clerical body has no sense of structure. It only has a sense of supreme leadership. And of
Mm.
course, if the community has a sense of supreme leadership, that is not very different from what the Hindu community has right now about Modi.
So we haven't. So your sense is, as we're wrapping up, is that we live in democracies, but we haven't learned to live in a democracy.
Yes,
We
yes,
don't recognize our own inherent rights, and as we live in a democracy, and then we have internalized these biases. We've internalized our servitude. The status of servitude. We've internalized that, so we think
yeah,
it's not our place to be able to speak about that. Whether and yes, I this is something that I push here. We all push here. You can walk into any place in your abayas, in your hijabs, in your with your beards, whatever. That is you. You're just as much a citizen as the person next door with who perhaps is dressed very differently, speaks very differently from you. And this is something that, yes, we a lot of us have not had that education, and that's something that we continue to do over here. I hope people listening continue to do that in India, and there's a change in the way our organizations function. We need that for our survival. We need to understand what that means to be Muslim in a democracy.
yeah.
To form coalitions and not just be within our own little bubble, because that bubble's bursting.
Yeah,
So,
and to be rights bearing and rights enforcing citizen, because it will then translate into we've lost space. We've just lost space everywhere. And when I say we, I say Muslims, I mean the oppressed, I mean all the kind of people that are living, we just have lost all space, whether in the media, whether in political parties, whether in the services, whether in representation, in all kinds. It's just we've lost all kinds of space, and only a reimagining, like you point out, uh, reimagining, which will lead to various changes within our home, especially as well, especially our relations with women, especially and the young generation of Muslim women are really reigniting it and not accepting it. And that is the only way. Each of us are important citizens, and we cannot just continue to be the way we are. We have to recapture these spaces through all democratic but absolutely revolutionary means.
thank you so much for being here today and sharing your thoughts and your work. We're really, really grateful for all the work that you guys have done. It's helped us definitely put it in perspective for a lot of decision makers here. So we're thankful to you for that. We hope to continue these conversations. And thank you all for being here today. The show's ending, but I do want all of you to leave with that message that each one of us is a contributing member of the democracies that we live in, and we should act like it. We need to learn our civil liberties. We need to stand up for the people whose civil liberties have been taken away from them. So thank you so much. Salam alaikum.